Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims during Passover, the annual feast that drew Jews from across the Roman Empire to the city that held their temple, their history, their identity. The streets overflowed with travellers seeking lodging, merchants hawking lambs for sacrifice, families preparing for the ritual meal that commemorated Israel's deliverance from Egyptian bondage. It was a time of celebration, of remembering how the blood of the Passover lamb on doorposts had saved the firstborn of Israel when the angel of death passed through Egypt, how God had brought his people out of slavery into freedom, how divine power had triumphed over human oppression. But in this particular Passover, the year when Jesus of Nazareth would complete his 3rd year of public ministry, the celebration was shadowed by tensions that threatened to explode into violence at any moment. The Roman governor Pontius Pilate had moved from his comfortable headquarters in Caesarea Maritima to Jerusalem specifically for the feast, bringing additional troops to reinforce the garrison that normally kept order in the city. Rome knew that religious festivals were flashpoints, that crowds inflamed by ancient memories of liberation could quickly become mobs demanding present freedom, that the line between celebrating past deliverance and demanding current revolution was dangerously thin. The Jewish religious establishment, the high priest Caiaphas and his council of Sadducees and Pharisees, walked their own tightrope between Roman demands for order and popular expectations for messianic deliverance. They had watched Jesus' ministry with growing alarm as his following expanded, as his teachings challenged their authority, as his miracles gave credence to claims that many began to whisper, that this might be the Messiah, the promised deliverer, the one who would restore the kingdom to Israel. The raising of Lazarus just days before in nearby Bethany had been the final straw. A man 4 days dead, already decomposing, called forth from the tomb by nothing more than Jesus' voice. It was a sign too powerful to ignore, a miracle too public to suppress. The council had decided Jesus must die, not because they had tried him fairly and found him guilty of crimes worthy of death, but because his continued existence threatened the delicate balance of power they had negotiated with Rome. "It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish," Caiaphas had declared, speaking more prophetically than he knew. The high priest meant it politically. Better to sacrifice this troublemaker than to risk Roman retaliation against the Jewish people. But his words carried theological freight he could not have intended. Yes, it was better that one man die for the people, though not in the way Caiaphas imagined. This one man would indeed die for the people, but as substitute rather than scapegoat, as saviour rather than political expedient, accomplishing through his death what no political calculation could achieve. Jesus knew all of this. As he gathered with his 12 disciples in an upper room in Jerusalem for the Passover meal, he knew that the betrayer sat among them, that the religious authorities had already decided his fate, that the mechanisms of his arrest and execution were already in motion. He knew, as the 4th Gospel would emphasize, that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father. This was not the hour of his defeat, but of his glorification, not the moment when his enemies would triumph, but when he would accomplish the mission for which he had come. The room where they gathered was large, the table prepared, the Passover elements ready. The unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, the wine, the roasted lamb. Jesus and his disciples reclined around the table in the traditional posture for the meal, and the teacher began to guide them through the familiar liturgy that every Jewish family observed on this night. But as the meal progressed, Jesus did something unprecedented, something that transformed the ancient ritual into something radically new. He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to the disciples with words that must have seemed strange, troubling, impossible to fully comprehend in the moment. "Take, eat, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." His body, given for them? The disciples handled the bread, ate it as commanded, but what could this mean? The Passover lamb's body was roasted and consumed, but Jesus was here among them, alive, whole, breaking bread with them. How could his body be given? When? For what purpose? Then he took the cup of wine, gave thanks, and offered it with words even more disturbing. Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Blood of the covenant, the phrase echoed with theological significance. Moses had sprinkled blood on the people at Sinai, saying, "Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you." But this cup, Jesus' blood, poured out for forgiveness? The law said clearly that the life of the flesh is in the blood, that blood made atonement for sin through its sacrificial use. But Jesus was speaking of his own blood, his own sacrifice, his own death as the mechanism through which forgiveness would come. The disciples could not have fully understood what they were hearing, what they were participating in. They were living through the inauguration of something entirely new, while performing a ritual as old as their national identity. The Passover celebrated liberation from Egypt. This meal, this Last Supper, though they did not yet know it was the last, was instituting something greater. Liberation from sin itself, deliverance from death, a new covenant sealed not with animal blood but with the blood of the Son of God himself. And then Jesus spoke words that shattered whatever comfort the familiar ritual might have provided. "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." The announcement hit like a physical blow. Betray. One of them. The 12 who had left everything to follow him, who had witnessed his miracles, who had heard his teachings, who had been with him through 3 years of ministry. Impossible. Yet Jesus had spoken, and they had learned that what he said proved true, however impossible it seemed in the moment. They began to question among themselves which of them it could be, each apparently suspecting himself more readily than his companions. "Is it I, Lord?" they asked one by one, the question revealing both their recognition of their own capacity for failure and their inability to imagine actually committing such betrayal. Peter, characteristically bold, signalled to John, the beloved disciple, who reclined closest to Jesus, to ask directly who the betrayer was. Jesus answered cryptically, dipping bread into the common dish and giving it to Judas Iscariot, the group's treasurer, the one who had been skimming from the common fund, the one who had objected when Mary anointed Jesus with expensive perfume. And then, in a moment heavy with spiritual significance, Satan entered Judas. The Gospel records it plainly, without elaboration. Then, after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. The betrayal was not merely human treachery, but cosmic rebellion. Not just one man's failure, but the evil one's direct assault on the Son of God. Jesus, knowing all things, told Judas to do quickly what he was going to do. Judas departed, leaving the 11 remaining disciples confused about what had just transpired, but Jesus clear-eyed about what was coming. John's Gospel notes simply, "And it was night." The detail is both literal, Judas left the upper room after dark, and profoundly symbolic. Night in the fourth Gospel signifies more than absence of sunlight. It represents spiritual darkness, the realm of evil, the time when those who hate the light do their works. Judas went out into the night physically and spiritually, carrying his intention to betray the light of the world into the darkness where such betrayal could be accomplished. In the upper room, Jesus continued teaching the remaining 11, offering them comfort and instruction, promising the Holy Spirit, praying for them with words of such intimacy and depth that the church would treasure them as the high priestly prayer, Jesus' longest recorded prayer, his intercession for his disciples and for all who would believe through their testimony. He spoke of going to prepare a place for them, remaining in him as branches remain in the vine, of the coming persecution they would face, of the love that would mark them as his disciples. He prepared them, though they could not yet grasp the fullness of what he was saying, for the catastrophe that was hours away, and for the mission that would follow his resurrection. Finally the meal concluded, and they sang a hymn, almost certainly the Hallel, Psalms 115 through 118, the traditional songs of praise that concluded the Passover liturgy. Can we imagine Jesus singing these words knowing what awaited him? "The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave came over me. I was overcome by distress and sorrow. Then I called on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me." He sang of distress he was about to experience, of death that would entangle him, of calling out for salvation. And then, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvellous in our eyes. He sang prophecy about himself, about his rejection and ultimate vindication, about the Father's plan that would seem like defeat, but would prove to be victory. They left the upper room and descended into the Kidron Valley, that deep ravine separating Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. The path took them down steep slopes, across the brook that gave the valley its name, a stream that during Passover ran red with the blood of thousands of sacrificed lambs being washed from the temple precincts. Jesus walked through water tinged with sacrificial blood, heading toward the place where he would sweat drops of blood in anguish, moving inexorably toward the moment when his own blood would be shed not on an altar but on a cross. The Kidron Valley carried its own historical weight. This was the path David had taken when fleeing from his rebellious son Absalom, the king driven from his city by betrayal, going up the Mount of Olives weeping, his head covered in grief. Now David's greater son walked the same path, betrayed not by family but by one of his chosen followers, going to his own agony, carrying grief that would eclipse anything David had known. This was also where Josiah had destroyed the idols and pagan altars he removed from Jerusalem, where the unclean things were burned and ground to dust. It was a place of judgment, of purification, of endings and burnings. And Jesus crossed through it on his way to Gethsemane. The full moon of Passover lit their path as they climbed the western slope of the Mount of Olives. This mountain too resonated with prophetic significance. Zechariah had prophesied that on the day of the Lord's coming, his feet would stand on the Mount of Olives, that the mountain would split in two, that living water would flow from Jerusalem. Jesus had taught on this mount earlier in the week, had wept over Jerusalem from these slopes, had spoken of the temple's destruction and his returning glory. Now he returned to a familiar place, a garden of olive trees where he had often gone with his disciples to pray, to teach, to find respite from the crowds that pressed upon him in the city. He had warned them as they walked. "You will all fall away because of me this night," he said, quoting Zechariah. "I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." Peter, ever impetuous, ever certain of his own courage, had protested vigorously, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Even when Jesus predicted specifically that Peter would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed, Peter insisted, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." The others said the same, all of them confident in a loyalty they did not yet know they lacked, all of them sincere in commitments they would prove unable to keep. They reached the garden called Gethsemane, the name meaning oil press, the place where olives were crushed to extract their oil, the location that would become synonymous with anguish and surrender, with the moment when the fate of humanity hung in the balance, and the Son of God chose the path of suffering over the escape that was always available to him. The night had begun with bread and wine, with fellowship and teaching, with hymns and promises. It would continue in a garden in prayer and agony, in betrayal and arrest. The shadow of the cross had been lengthening across Jesus' entire ministry. From the beginning, he had known what awaited him, had spoken of his death in increasingly explicit terms as the time approached, had set his face toward Jerusalem knowing that the city killed the prophets sent to it. But now the shadow had become almost tangible. The cross no longer a distant inevitability, but an approaching reality. Within hours he would be arrested, tried, condemned, executed. The mechanisms were already in motion. Judas was even now leading soldiers and temple guards to this place. The religious authorities were gathering for the illegal nighttime trial. Pilate was asleep in his Jerusalem residence, unaware that he would soon be pressured to execute a man he would find no fault in. But before arrest and trial, before whips and thorns and nails, before crowds shouting for his crucifixion and soldiers gambling for his garments, there would be Gethsemane. There would be prayer, there would be a cup offered, a terrible cup full of wrath and judgment, a cup that could pass away if the Father willed it, a cup that the Son would drink to the dregs because the Father's will required it, and the world's redemption depended on it. The night had begun with fellowship. It would move toward agony. But in that agony, in that garden, in that prayer, the cross would truly be chosen. The victory of Calvary would be forged in Gethsemane. The triumph of Easter decided on Thursday night. The salvation of the world accomplished not primarily through what happened on Friday morning, but through what Jesus decided on Thursday night, when he looked into the cup the Father offered and said, "Not my will, but yours be done." The grove of ancient olive trees stood at the foot of the Mount of Olives, their gnarled trunks and twisted branches testimony to centuries of growth, their silvery leaves catching the light of the Passover moon. This was Gethsemane, a name that carried practical meaning to anyone familiar with olive cultivation. Gethsemane, the place of the oil press, where olives harvested from these very trees were crushed between heavy stones, pressed until the oil ran out, the fruit's essence extracted through the application of inexorable weight and pressure. The symbolism would have been lost on no one who knew what was about to unfold here. Jesus had chosen this place deliberately, had brought his disciples to this familiar spot where they had gathered many times before, where the presence of the press and the crushing stones provided a physical vocabulary for what was about to happen spiritually. Here, the Son of God would be pressed down by weight more crushing than any millstone, would endure pressure that would extract from him not oil but blood, would be crushed not for agricultural production but for human redemption. Yet in the moment of their arrival, the 11 remaining disciples, Judas already having departed on his treacherous errand, could not have grasped the full significance of where they were or what was about to occur. They had walked this path before, had rested in this grove, had listened to Jesus teach beneath these trees. It was a place of peace and prayer, a refuge from the crowds that constantly pressed upon them in Jerusalem, a quiet space where their teacher could withdraw to commune with his Father. They expected, perhaps, that Jesus would pray as he often did, that they would rest while he spent time alone with God, that after some period of prayer they would return to wherever they were lodging in or near the city. But this night was different. The atmosphere itself seemed heavy with something the disciples could sense but not name, a weight in the air, a tension that suggested approaching crisis. Jesus himself was different. The teacher who had spoken with such authority at supper, who had offered such profound comfort and instruction, who had prayed with such confidence for them and for all who would believe, that same Jesus now moved with a gravity, a somberness, that communicated distress in ways that words had not yet articulated. He stopped the group near the entrance to the garden and gave instructions to 8 of them. "Sit here while I go over there and pray." The command was simple, practical, establishing a boundary between where they would remain and where he would go. But there was something in his manner, something in his voice, that suggested this was not routine, that what was about to happen was not ordinary, that the prayer he was going to offer was of a different order than the prayers they had heard him pray countless times before. Then Jesus did something he had done only twice before during his ministry. He selected 3 from among the 12 for special proximity, special witness to something significant. Peter, James, and John, the same 3 he had taken up the mountain when he was transfigured before them, when his face shone like the sun and his garments became white as light, when Moses and Elijah appeared and spoke with him about his coming departure. The same 3 he had allowed into Jairus' house when he raised the man's daughter from death. The inner circle, the ones who had witnessed glory and resurrection, now called to witness something different, something darker, something that would challenge everything they thought they understood about their master. Jesus brought these 3 deeper into the garden, away from the other 8, and as they walked, something changed in him so dramatically that the Gospels struggle to find adequate words to describe it. He began to be sorrowful and troubled. He began to be greatly distressed and troubled. The Greek words pile up in the text's attempt to capture the reality. Lipistai, to be grieved, ademonein, to be in anguish, ekthambistei, to be greatly amazed or appalled. These are strong words, words that speak of emotional devastation, of psychological anguish that approaches the unbearable, of a condition that lies beyond normal human sorrow and enters into something more profound, more terrible. Then Jesus spoke to the 3, and his words crystallized the agony they could see overtaking him. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." The statement defies easy understanding. This was the Son of God, the one through whom all things were made, the eternal Word who had existed with the Father before creation began. This was the miracle worker who had demonstrated authority over wind and waves, who had multiplied bread and fish, who had healed the sick and raised the dead. This was the teacher who had spoken with unwavering confidence about his Father, about his mission, about his coming death and resurrection. Yet here in this garden, in this moment, he declared himself overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. The Greek phrase perilepos suggests being surrounded by grief, encircled by sorrow, trapped within emotional anguish that presses in from every direction with crushing force. And the addition hios thanatou, unto death, indicates that this was not merely intense emotional pain, but sorrow so profound it threatened his very life. Medical science would later recognize that extreme emotional distress can indeed kill, that the heart can fail under the weight of overwhelming psychological trauma, that grief can become physiologically lethal. Jesus was not speaking metaphorically or hyperbolically. He was describing a genuine, deadly assault on his body and soul, an anguish so complete it endangered his physical survival. Why? What could produce such devastating sorrow in the Son of God? He had known from the beginning that he would die. He had predicted his death repeatedly to his disciples. He had set his face toward Jerusalem knowing what awaited him there. The physical pain of crucifixion, while horrific, could not alone account for this level of distress. Many martyrs had faced death with courage and even joy, singing hymns as they burned or were torn apart. What Jesus faced in Gethsemane was something more than physical suffering, something that went beyond even the cruelest execution. He was looking into the cup the Father was offering him, seeing what it contained, measuring the cost of drinking it. And what he saw there, the full weight of human sin, the experience of divine wrath, the prospect of bearing in his own person the guilt of the world, the horror of separation from the Father with whom he had enjoyed eternal communion, all of this came crashing down upon him in Gethsemane, with a force that crushed him to the ground, that wrung from him drops of blood, that threatened to kill him before he could reach the cross. But we're getting ahead of the narrative. In this moment, Jesus asked the 3 disciples to remain and watch with him, not to understand, not to fix, not to comfort, simply to watch, to stay awake, to be present with him in his anguish. It was the request of someone facing the darkest night of the soul, asking friends to simply be there, to provide the bare minimum of human companionship, to witness without comprehending, to stay alert while he grappled with anguish beyond their capacity to share or relieve. The 3 disciples agreed, settling themselves near where Jesus indicated. They had seen him troubled before, had witnessed him angry at the hard-heartedness of religious leaders, had heard him weep over Jerusalem. But this was different, and they must have known it even if they could not articulate how. Their teacher, their Lord, the one they had come to recognize as Messiah, he was in distress so profound it frightened them, so deep it challenged everything they thought they knew about him. Jesus withdrew from them about a stone's throw further into the garden. The measurement is precise, practical, close enough that they could see him in the moonlight, far enough for privacy, near enough to call if he needed them, but distant enough for the solitude prayer required. He was not abandoning them or leaving them behind. He was establishing the space necessary for what he had to do, for the prayer he had to pray, for the struggle he had to wage alone. The garden itself seemed to hold its breath. The ancient olive trees, which had stood through countless seasons, which had weathered storms and droughts, which had witnessed whatever history had unfolded in this place across the centuries, they became silent witnesses to something unprecedented. The oil press, which had crushed countless tons of olives in its operation, stood as mute testimony to the crushing that was about to occur not to fruit but to the Son of God himself. The stones that mark the garden, the paths worn by countless feet, the very earth itself, all of it became the stage for a cosmic drama, a spiritual battle, a moment that would determine the fate of every human being who had ever lived or would ever live. Peter, James, and John watched as Jesus moved away from them. They saw him in silhouette against the moonlight, saw him step further into the shadows beneath the olive trees. They could hear him, perhaps, or at least hear the sound of someone praying intensely, if not the words themselves. And they waited, as he'd asked, keeping watch as he had commanded, being present because he had requested their presence. But they could not understand what they were witnessing. The transfiguration had been glorious, overwhelming in its beauty and majesty, difficult to comprehend but clearly wonderful. This was different. This was darkness visible, anguish made manifest, something that felt wrong, even though they could not articulate why. Their master should not be in this kind of distress. The Messiah should not be overwhelmed with sorrow. The Son of God should not be struggling in such evident agony. Everything they had seen Jesus do and say across 3 years of ministry had shown him as authoritative, powerful, in control. This scene contradicted all of that, presented them with an image of their Lord that nothing had prepared them to witness. The location of this struggle was itself significant. A garden, that most ancient of biblical settings, the place where human history had taken its catastrophic turn, where the first Adam had been tested and had failed, where the serpent's lie had found receptive ears, where the fruit was eaten and paradise was lost. Eden, the garden of God's planting, had been the site of humanity's fall. Now another garden, Gethsemane, would be the site where humanity's redemption would be secured, where the second Adam would face his test and would pass it, where obedience would be chosen over rebellion, where the Father's will would be embraced despite every human instinct screaming for escape. The parallel was too perfect to be accidental. The first Adam had faced temptation in a garden of beauty and abundance, in paradise where every need was met, where fellowship with God was unbroken, where no suffering existed. He had fallen when the stakes could not have been lower, when obedience cost nothing, and disobedience had not yet been tried. The second Adam would face his test in a garden of crushing, in a place named for weight and pressure, in circumstances of extreme distress, when obedience would cost everything, and disobedience offered immediate relief. Where the first Adam had failed in comfort, the second Adam would succeed in agony. Where the first had chosen self over God, the second would choose God over self. Where the first had brought death, the second would purchase life. But again, we move too quickly. The outcome was not yet certain, not because Jesus might have failed, but because in the mystery of the incarnation, he had to genuinely face the choice, had to truly grapple with the alternatives, had to experience in his full humanity the desperate desire to escape what he faced, while in his full divinity, remaining committed to the Father's will and the world's salvation. The tension between these two realities, the human revulsion from suffering and the divine commitment to redemption, was about to produce an agony that would manifest physically, that would become visible in blood, that would require supernatural intervention to survive. The disciples waited and watched as Jesus withdrew further into the garden. They could see him still, see his figure among the trees, see him moving, perhaps hear him praying, though not the words themselves. They had been commanded to watch, and they were watching, though what they were watching was beyond their comprehension, though the significance of this moment would only become clear in retrospect, though they were present at the real decisive battle of Calvary, though the crucifixion still lay hours in the future. The garden held its breath, the moment stretched, the weight gathered, and Jesus, about a stone's throw from his closest friends, about to be pressed like the olives for which this garden was named, prepared to pray the prayer that would determine everything, to face the cup that contained wrath and judgment, to choose the cross before the nails ever touched his flesh. Gethsemane was about to become what it would be remembered as for 2,000 years, not just a grove of olive trees on the Mount of Olives, but the place where surrender became victory, where weakness became strength, where the Son of God demonstrated what it truly means to say, "Not my will, but yours be done." Jesus went forward alone, moving deeper into the darkness beneath the olive trees, and then he fell. Not knelt, not bowed, not assumed the posture of a reverent prayer, he fell. Matthew's Gospel says he fell on his face. Mark records that he fell on the ground. Luke describes him as kneeling down. The accounts complement rather than contradict each other, suggesting that Jesus first fell to his knees and then collapsed completely, prostrating himself on the earth with his face in the dirt. The position of utter desperation, of complete abasement, of someone so overwhelmed that physical strength fails, and only the ground can support the weight of anguish that crushes down from above. This was not the posture of formal prayer that the disciples had seen him assume countless times before. This was collapse. This was the body manifesting what the soul was experiencing, the physical position reflecting the spiritual condition, the outer form expressing the inner reality of someone being pressed down by weight too great to bear while standing. The Son of God, through whom the worlds were made, by whom all things hold together, in whom all the fullness of deity dwells. He lay face down in the dirt, undone by what he faced, crushed by what he saw in the cup the Father was offering him. And then he prayed. The words that came from his lips in that moment have been preserved across the centuries, treasured by the Church, meditated upon by countless believers, examined by theologians, and yet they remain somehow unfathomable in their depths, mysterious in their combination of agony and submission, challenging in their honest expression of human desire meeting divine will. Abba, Father, he began, using both the Aramaic and Greek words for father, the intimate term a child would use combined with the formal title of respect and authority. It was the only time in the Gospels where Jesus is recorded using both terms together, the combination suggesting both the closeness of relationship and the weight of what he was addressing. Abba, the word that speaks of trust, of family bond, of the most intimate connection. Father, the word that acknowledges authority, sovereignty, the right to command and expect obedience. All things are possible for you. The statement acknowledged divine omnipotence, recognized that no limitation bound the Father's power, affirmed that God could accomplish whatever he willed. It was theology spoken in extremity, truth declared in the midst of crisis, recognition that the one to whom Jesus prayed possessed absolute power to change circumstances, to alter plans, to choose a different path if he desired. Remove this cup from me. The request came raw and honest, the expression of genuine human desire to escape suffering, the cry of someone who saw clearly what lay ahead and recoiled from it with every fibre of his being. This was not casual preference or mild reluctance. This was desperate plea, earnest petition, the appeal of someone who would give anything not to drink what the cup contained if any other way existed to accomplish the Father's purposes. But what was in the cup? Why did Jesus pray so desperately to avoid it? The image of the cup runs throughout Scripture as a symbol of divine judgment, of God's wrath against sin, of the fury of his holiness confronting human rebellion. The prophets had used this metaphor repeatedly, painting pictures of God making nations drink from the cup of his wrath, of people staggering under the weight of judgment, of divine fury poured out in full strength against wickedness. The psalmist had written, "In the hand of the Lord there is a cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours it out, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very dregs." Isaiah had described Jerusalem being made to drink from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, becoming drunk on the goblet that makes people stagger. Jeremiah had received from God the cup filled with the wine of my wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. Ezekiel had prophesied that the cup of God's wrath would be drunk down to the dregs, that those who drank it would tear their own breasts in anguish. This cup, this image of divine judgment, of holy wrath, of God's righteous fury against sin, this was what Jesus saw the Father offering him. But the sins that would fill this cup were not his own. The guilt that would overflow from it belonged to others. The wrath it contained was deserved by humanity, not by the sinless Son of God. Yet the plan of redemption required that he drink it, that he take into himself the judgment meant for others, that he experience in his own person the full fury of divine wrath against all the sin of all the people who would ever believe in him. To drink this cup meant more than physical suffering. It meant becoming sin, as Paul would later write. The one who knew no sin becoming sin so that in him, we might become the righteousness of God. It meant bearing the full weight of human guilt, carrying the moral filth of millennia of human rebellion, experiencing the horror of being identified with everything vile and wicked and corrupt that human beings had ever done or would ever do. It meant bearing not just the sins but the consequences, not just the guilt but the punishment, not just the liability but the actual execution of sentence. Most terribly, it meant separation from the Father. This was perhaps the deepest horror in the cup, the element that made it most unbearable to contemplate. Jesus had existed in eternal communion with the Father, had known from before the foundation of the world the intimacy of the Trinity, had experienced unbroken fellowship with the one he called Abba. The Father loved the Son. The Son delighted in the Father's presence. Between them existed a bond of affection and unity that no human relationship could begin to approximate. Yet to bear sin meant to experience the Father's wrath, and experiencing the Father's wrath meant separation, meant being cut off, meant the devastating reality that would be expressed on the cross in the cry of dereliction. My God, why have you forsaken me?" All of this Jesus saw in the cup. All of this he understood with perfect clarity. All of this pressed down upon him in Gethsemane with such weight that his body began to fail under the burden, that he fell to the ground, that he prayed with such intensity that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the earth. Luke, the physician, records this detail with clinical precision. Jesus' sweat became like great drops of blood. The condition is known medically as hematidrosis, a rare phenomenon that occurs under conditions of extreme psychological stress. The tiny blood vessels in the sweat glands can rupture, mixing blood with perspiration, producing the appearance of sweating blood. It happens when anguish becomes so intense that it manifests physically, when emotional trauma produces physiological effects, when the soul's agony literally breaks through the skin. The fact that Jesus experienced this condition testifies to the reality of his suffering in Gethsemane. This was not theatrical display or symbolic gesture. This was genuine physiological distress, the body reacting to psychological trauma of extraordinary intensity. The Son of God, in his full humanity, was being crushed by the weight of what he faced, pressed so severely that blood emerged through his pores, demonstrating that his prayer was not casual or routine but desperate, that his request to avoid the cup was not rhetorical but earnest, that what he was experiencing in that garden was agony of an order that pushed human endurance to its absolute limit. Yet even in the midst of this desperate plea, even as he prayed for the cup to be removed, Jesus added the words that transformed request into submission. "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours, be done." Not my will, the human will, the will of the incarnate Son experiencing full humanity, the will that naturally and legitimately desired to avoid suffering and death and separation from the Father, that will was real, was acknowledged, was expressed honestly in prayer. Jesus was not pretending to struggle. He genuinely did not want to drink the cup. His human nature recoiled from it with an intensity that produced blood sweat. The request for the cup to pass was authentic, arising from real human desire to escape real suffering. But yours be done. The qualification that followed the request revealed the deeper commitment, the ultimate loyalty, the fundamental orientation of Jesus' life and ministry. What the Father willed would be accomplished, regardless of what the Son's human nature desired. The divine will would prevail over human preference. Obedience would triumph over comfort. The mission would be completed regardless of cost. This was not passive resignation or fatalistic acceptance of the inevitable. This was active choice, deliberate submission, the decision to embrace the Father's plan even when that plan led through the valley of the shadow of death, even when it required drinking a cup of wrath to its dregs, even when it meant experiencing separation from the Father for the first and only time in all eternity. Jesus was not trapped by circumstances beyond his control. He was choosing the cross, embracing the mission, accepting the cup, not because he had to, but because he loved the Father and loved the world enough to endure what love required. The tension in that prayer between "remove this cup" and "your will be done" captures something essential about the incarnation and about genuine prayer itself. Jesus was fully human, experiencing full human emotions, facing full human limitations, enduring full human suffering. The desire to avoid the cup was not sinful or faithless. It was human. Self-preservation is built into human nature by divine design. The instinct to flee pain and seek comfort is not evil. It is normal. Jesus experienced all of this genuinely, honestly, without pretense or theatricality. But Jesus was also fully divine, fully committed to the Father's purposes, fully oriented toward accomplishing redemption regardless of personal cost. His humanity shrank from the cup. His divinity embraced it. His human will desired escape. His divine will chose obedience. The two wills did not conflict because both were ultimately submitted to the Father, the human will expressing natural desire while remaining subordinate to divine purpose, the divine will ensuring that human preference would not derail the mission of salvation. The prayer Jesus prayed in Gethsemane became the template for all Christian prayer, the model of how creatures should approach the Creator, the demonstration of what it means to bring genuine desires to God while remaining committed to His will above our own preferences. We are invited to be honest about what we want, to express our desires freely, to ask for what seems best to us. But we are also called to subordinate those desires to divine wisdom, to trust that God's will is better than our preferences, to choose obedience over comfort when the two conflict. As Jesus prayed, something extraordinary happened. An angel appeared to him, strengthening him. Luke alone records this detail, and it raises as many questions as it answers. Why did Jesus need strengthening? How did the angel provide it? What form did this supernatural assistance take? The text does not elaborate, simply noting that an angel from heaven appeared and strengthened him. The angel did not remove the cup, did not change the circumstances, did not make the suffering less severe or the choice less costly. The strengthening was not rescue, but empowerment to endure, not elimination of suffering, but provision of capacity to bear it. This was heaven's response to Jesus' prayer, not alteration of the plan, but supernatural assistance to accomplish it, not escape from the cross, but strength to reach it, not exemption from suffering, but grace sufficient to endure it. The appearance of an angel to Jesus raises profound theological questions. The Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, the one through whom angels themselves were created, he received ministry from an angel. He needed strengthening from a created being. The paradox highlights the reality of the incarnation, the genuine limitations Jesus accepted when he took on human nature, the authentic humanity that could be tired, hungry, tempted, and in need of supernatural assistance to endure what no merely human person could survive. The angel's presence also testified to heaven's attention to what was happening in Gethsemane. This was not a private struggle, not a moment hidden from cosmic awareness, not a prayer offered in isolation from the watching universe. Heaven was attending, observing, caring about the outcome. The Father sent the angel providing assistance, demonstrating that even in the moment of Jesus' deepest human distress, divine care surrounded him, supernatural resources were available to him. Heaven itself bent toward this garden to ensure that the Son had what he needed to complete his mission. After being strengthened, Jesus prayed more earnestly. The intensity increased rather than decreased. The angel's assistance did not reduce the agony, but enabled him to press into it more deeply, to grapple with it more fully, to fight the battle to its conclusion. And it was in this period of intensified prayer that the sweating of blood occurred, that the physical manifestation of spiritual anguish became visible, that what was happening internally broke through to external reality. How long did this prayer last? The Gospels do not specify. Long enough for the disciples to fall asleep repeatedly, long enough for the struggle to reach its crisis and its resolution, long enough for Jesus to face fully what drinking the cup would mean, to count the cost completely, to make the choice consciously and deliberately. This was not a moment's decision but a sustained battle, not an instant's choice but a prolonged wrestling with alternatives, not an easy submission but a hard-won obedience forged through intense spiritual conflict. but the outcome was never really in doubt. Not because Jesus was play-acting, not because the struggle was not genuine, but because his fundamental commitment had already been established before the foundation of the world. The Lamb had been slain from the foundation of the world. The plan of redemption had been determined in eternity. The Father and the Son had agreed upon this path before creation began. What happened in Gethsemane was the incarnate Son, in his full humanity, catching up to what his divinity had always been committed to, bringing his human will into conscious alignment with the divine will that had never wavered. The cup would not pass away. Jesus would drink it. Not because he had to, not because alternatives did not exist, not because he was trapped by fate or necessity. He would drink it because he chose to, because obedience mattered more than comfort, because the Father's will was supreme, because the world's redemption required it, because love for the Father and love for humanity, demanded nothing less than everything. The prayer was prayed, the struggle was engaged, the battle was fought in that garden, beneath those olive trees, on that night when everything hung in the balance, and the decision was made, the cross was chosen, the cup was accepted, the path was embraced. What happened 3 days later on Golgotha would be the execution of a plan determined that night in Gethsemane, the completion of a choice made before the first nail was driven, the fulfillment of a prayer prayed in blood sweat beneath the Passover moon. Not my will, but yours be done. Jesus rose from his prayer, his face still bearing the marks of having been pressed into the earth, his garments likely damp with the sweat that had mingled with blood, and he returned to where he had left Peter, James, and John. He had asked them to watch with him, to remain alert, to provide the simple companionship of presence during his hour of greatest need. The walk back to where they waited was short, perhaps 30 or 40 paces, the distance of a stone's throw, but in the state he was in, having just wrestled with the weight of the world's sin and the cup of divine wrath, even that brief walk must have required effort. He found them sleeping. The discovery carried multiple layers of pain. Jesus was enduring the most intense spiritual and emotional crisis of his earthly life, fighting a battle that would determine the salvation of humanity, experiencing anguish so severe it had literally produced blood from his pores. And his closest friends, the 3 he had specifically asked to stay awake and watch, the ones he had brought deeper into the garden precisely because he wanted them near, they could not keep their eyes open for even an hour. The scene captures something profound about human weakness and divine loneliness. Jesus had withdrawn about a stone's throw for privacy and prayer, but he had not withdrawn so far that companionship became impossible. He had maintained proximity, had stayed within earshot, had positioned himself where he could return to them and they could see him. He was not asking them to pray with him, that battle he had to fight alone. He was not asking them to understand what he was experiencing. They could not possibly comprehend it. He was asking only that they stay awake, that they watch, that they be present and alert during his darkest hour. And they could not do even that. They slept while he bled. They dozed while he wrestled. They rested while he agonized. The contrast could not be more stark or more painful. The disciples' sleep was not malicious or intentionally cruel. They were not trying to hurt Jesus or demonstrate indifference to his suffering. But their weakness, their inability to stay alert even when specifically asked, their human frailty that overcame the best of intentions, all of this left Jesus more alone in his suffering than if he had sent them away entirely. Jesus spoke to Peter specifically. "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch with me 1 hour?" The use of Simon rather than Peter carried significance. Peter was the name Jesus had given him, the identity he had called him into: rock, foundation, the one who would be strong. Simon was his original name, the identity of weakness and failure. In this moment of disappointment, Jesus addressed him by the name that reflected present reality rather than future promise, spoke to the man who was failing rather than the disciple who would one day lead the church. The question, "Could you not watch 1 hour?" was not merely rhetorical accusation. It carried genuine pain, authentic disappointment, the hurt of someone who had asked for something simple and been let down. Jesus had prayed intensely for at least an hour, perhaps longer. He had asked only that they stay awake during that time, that they keep watch, that they remain alert. It was not a difficult request. Soldiers stood watch for hours at a time. Fishermen stayed awake through the night tending nets. Ordinary people remained alert through far less significant occasions. Yet Peter, who had just hours before declared his willingness to die with Jesus, who had sworn he would never fall away, who had protested his loyalty more loudly than any other disciple, this same Peter could not stay awake for a single hour when his Lord needed him most. But Jesus did not leave Peter in his failure without instruction, or without understanding of the deeper dynamics at play. He told them, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." The command was both practical and prophetic. Practically, they needed to stay awake and pray because the events about to unfold would test them beyond anything they had previously experienced. Betrayal, arrest, trial, execution. All of this was coming within hours, and they would need spiritual resources they did not currently possess to endure it without complete collapse. Their prayer should be that they would not enter into temptation, not the temptation to sin in some generic sense, but the specific testing that was approaching, the crisis that would reveal whether their faith was genuine or superficial, whether their loyalty was deep or merely emotional. Prophetically, Jesus was warning them about what was coming. They would be tempted to flee, to deny, to abandon. Peter especially would face testing that would sift him like wheat, that would bring him to the point of cursing and swearing that he did not know Jesus, that would reduce him to bitter tears of repentance. The others would scatter like sheep when the shepherd was struck, would disappear into the night when arrest came, would hide in fear during the crucifixion. All of this was coming, and they needed to watch and pray if they hoped to survive it with their faith intact. But Jesus also offered explanation rather than mere condemnation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. This was not excuse-making, but honest acknowledgement of the human condition, of the gap between intention and execution, between what people want to do and what they can actually accomplish, between spiritual aspiration and physical limitation. The disciples' spirits were willing. They genuinely loved Jesus, sincerely wanted to support him, truly intended to stay awake and watch as he had asked. But their flesh was weak. They were tired from the Passover meal, exhausted from the emotional strain of the evening, physically incapable of maintaining alertness despite their best intentions. This tension between willing spirit and weak flesh is universal to human experience. We intend to pray but fall asleep. We plan to read scripture but run out of energy. We commit to disciplines we cannot maintain, promise changes we cannot sustain, declare loyalty we cannot fulfill. Not because we are insincere in the moment of commitment, not because we do not genuinely desire what we promise, but because human nature is fallen, because bodies tire, because resolve weakens, because the gap between intention and action is bridged only by grace that we often lack and power we do not possess. Jesus understood this. He was experiencing it himself in a unique way. His human nature recoiled from the cup, even as his divine will remained committed to drinking it. His body was failing under the weight of anguish, even as his spirit pressed forward toward obedience. He knew intimately what it meant for spirit to be willing while flesh was weak. His rebuke to the disciples was therefore tempered with compassion, his disappointment mixed with understanding, his correction offered with recognition that he was asking much from those whose capacity was limited. Yet the correction was still real. Understanding human weakness does not eliminate the need to fight against it. Compassion for failure does not mean accepting failure as inevitable. Jesus wanted them to do better, expected them to try harder, called them to watch and pray precisely because left to their own resources they would certainly fail. The command to watch and pray was not suggestion but necessity, not helpful advice but essential requirement for surviving what was coming. Jesus left them and went away a second time to pray. The pattern would repeat: prayer in agony, return to sleeping disciples, exhortation to watchfulness, return to prayer. The repetition itself is significant. This was not a brief struggle, quickly resolved, but a sustained battle fought over hours. Not a single moment of decision, but an extended wrestling with what obedience required. Jesus had to pray through the crisis, had to keep returning to the Father, had to continue choosing surrender until the choice was complete, the battle won, the cup fully accepted. The second prayer echoed the first. My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. The language shifted slightly from the first prayer. There it was. If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Here it was. If this cannot pass unless I drink it. The shift suggests progression in Jesus' wrestling, movement from asking whether another way might exist to acknowledging that if the cup cannot pass without being drunk, then he would drink it. The prayer was becoming less about the possibility of escape and more about the acceptance of necessity, less about whether the cup might be removed and more about willingness to drink it if it could not. But the core remained constant. Your will be done. Whatever else changed in the specific wording, this fundamental submission never wavered. Jesus was not trying to avoid the Father's will or escape his mission. He was honestly expressing human desire while remaining ultimately committed to divine purpose. He was demonstrating what real prayer looks like, bringing genuine feelings to God, expressing authentic preferences, asking for what seems best to human wisdom, while maintaining absolute submission to divine sovereignty and wisdom. After this second prayer, Jesus again returned to the disciples and again found them sleeping. Their eyes were heavy, the text says, not a casual drowsiness, but a weight pressing down on them, making it almost impossible to keep their eyelids open despite their desire to obey. Luke adds the detail that they were sleeping from sorrow, suggesting that their sleep was not merely physical tiredness, but a kind of emotional shutdown, grief and confusion so overwhelming that sleep became an escape, unconsciousness a refuge from distress they could neither understand nor bear. This time Jesus said nothing to them. What was there to say? He had already explained the need to watch and pray, had already warned about the weakness of flesh despite the willingness of spirit, had already expressed his disappointment and pain at their inability to stay alert. More words would not suddenly enable them to do what they had already proven incapable of doing. So he left them in their sleep and returned once more to prayer, fighting his battle alone, enduring his agony without the small comfort of human companionship he had hoped for but would not receive. The third prayer was the same as the others. Matthew records that he prayed saying the same words again. This repetition is not meaningless recitation but persistent wrestling, not mindless repetition, but sustained engagement with the same essential issue, not failure to move forward, but deepening of the same fundamental choice. Some battles cannot be won in a moment. Some decisions require extended time to fully embrace. Some submissions demand repeated recommitment until the will is fully aligned, the choice completely made, the surrender total. Jesus was learning obedience through what he suffered, as the book of Hebrews would later explain. Not learning in the sense of discovering something previously unknown, but learning in the experiential sense, the existential sense, the sense in which knowing about something intellectually is different from knowing it through lived experience. Jesus had always been obedient to the Father in his divine nature. Now he was learning what obedience costs in human nature, was experiencing what it means to choose the Father's will when human nature screams for relief, was discovering in his own flesh and spirit what submission requires when submission leads through the valley of the shadow of death. The three prayers, 3 times falling on his face, 3 times wrestling with the cup, 3 times surrendering to the Father's will, would soon find their mirror image in Peter's 3 denials. Jesus prayed 3 times and chose faithfulness. Peter would be asked 3 times and would choose betrayal. The contrast would become painfully clear in the hours ahead. Where Jesus persisted in prayer and emerged with resolve strengthened for the cross, Peter would fail in watchfulness and emerge with resolve shattered by fear. Where Jesus chose the Father's will despite the cost, Peter would choose self-preservation despite his promises. Where Jesus drank the cup he did not want to drink, Peter would deny the Lord he had sworn never to abandon. But that failure lay ahead. For now the disciples slept while Jesus prayed, oblivious to the cosmic significance of what was unfolding in their presence, unaware that the fate of humanity was being decided while they dozed, not comprehending that the battle that mattered most was not the one that would soon involve swords and arrests, but the one being fought in prayer beneath the olive trees. Heaven watched with intense interest, angels attending, the Father providing supernatural strength, the Spirit upholding the Son in his humanity. But the disciples slept, and in their sleep revealed the tragic reality of human weakness, the gap between good intentions and actual faithfulness, the distance between what people promise and what they can deliver. When Jesus returned the third time and found them still sleeping, his words carried a different tone. Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. The battle in prayer was over. The decision was made. The cup was accepted. The struggle had reached its conclusion, and Jesus emerged from it with resolve clarified, purpose solidified, with fully aligned with the Father's plan. Now the prayer would give way to action. The internal battle to external crisis, the wrestling in Gethsemane to the march toward Golgotha. The betrayer was approaching, and the time for prayer had passed. Now came the time for what prayer had prepared him to face: arrest, trial, torture, execution, the drinking of the cup he had accepted in the garden. The disciples woke to find their teacher's agony ended, but their own testing just beginning. They had slept through his greatest crisis. They would soon discover they were unprepared for their own. They had failed to watch when watching might have strengthened them. They would soon fail more dramatically when the watching gave way to doing. When the time came not to stay awake but to stay loyal. Not to pray but to act. Not to fight sleep but to fight fear. The garden had witnessed it all. The trees stood silent. The oil press waited for the next harvest. The stones lay where they had lain for centuries. But something had changed in Gethsemane that night. The second Adam had succeeded where the first had failed. The willing spirit had triumphed over weak flesh. The cup had been accepted, though every human instinct recoiled from it. The cross had been chosen, though every path away from it remained open. And heaven itself, which had watched with bated breath as the Son wrestled with the Father's will, could now breathe in relief, could send the angel away, could prepare for what came next. The crucial battle was won. The decisive choice was made. The rest was execution of a plan now firmly established. Gethsemane had determined Golgotha. The prayer had sealed the cross. The surrender in the garden guaranteed the victory on the third day. While Jesus was still speaking to his disciples, while the words "Rise, let us be going" still hung in the night air, the sound came, the tramping of many feet, the clink of weapons and armour, the flicker of torches approaching through the darkness. Judas had arrived, and he had not come alone. Behind him marched what John's Gospel describes as detachment of soldiers, along with officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, not a small arresting party, but a substantial force, perhaps several hundred men, armed and prepared as though expecting violent resistance from a dangerous criminal or a revolutionary leader with militant followers. The size of the force was telling. Either the religious authorities genuinely feared that Jesus commanded a following willing to fight for him, or they wanted to ensure overwhelming superiority to prevent any possibility of escape or rescue. The Gospel accounts describe them carrying torches, lanterns and weapons, swords and clubs, the instruments of arrest and enforcement. The irony was profound. They came with lights to arrest the light of the world, carried torches to capture the one who had declared, "I am the light of the world," brought fire to apprehend the one who would baptize with the Holy Spirit and with fire. The flickering torchlight illuminated a scene that would be remembered for 2 millennia as the ultimate act of betrayal. Judas stepped forward from the armed crowd, approaching Jesus with apparent familiarity and affection. He had told the soldiers and temple guards earlier, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." The kiss would be the signal. the sign that distinguished Jesus from his disciples in the darkness, the mark of identification that would initiate the arrest. And Judas kissed him. The Greek word Matthew uses is kataphileo, an intensified form meaning to kiss warmly, affectionately, repeatedly. This was not a casual greeting, but an emphatic display of intimacy, not a mere brush of the cheek, but an embrace that communicated fondness and closeness. The gesture made the betrayal all the more heinous. Judas did not simply point to Jesus from a distance or whisper his identity to the guards. He came close, touched him, used the very expression of love and friendship as the instrument of treachery. Jesus' response to this betrayal reveals his extraordinary composure in the face of evil, and his sovereignty even in the moment of apparent defeat. He addressed Judas calmly, "Friend, do what you came to do." The word translated friend, heteros in Greek, is not the warm term of intimate friendship, but a word used for companion or associate, carrying a note of formal distance. Yet Jesus still called him friend, still spoke to him as one who had been part of the inner circle, still treated him with dignity even as Judas enacted the ultimate indignity. Matthew also records Jesus asking a question that cut to the heart of the betrayal's horror. "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" The query forced Judas to face what he was doing, to recognize the particular evil of his method, to understand that he was not merely identifying a criminal, but betraying a teacher, using not just information, but intimacy as his weapon, perverting the sign of love into an instrument of death. But if Jesus' interaction with Judas demonstrated his patient dignity in the face of betrayal, his interaction with the arresting force demonstrated his sovereign authority even in the moment of arrest. John's Gospel provides details the other accounts omit, painting a picture of Jesus not as a victim overwhelmed by superior numbers, but as one fully in control, choosing to be arrested rather than being captured against his will. When the soldiers and officials approached, Jesus stepped forward and asked them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus replied with two words in Greek that reverberate with divine significance, "I am." In English translations, this usually appears as "I am he," adding the pronoun to make sense in English grammar. But the Greek simply has "I am," the same construction God used to identify himself to Moses at the burning bush, the name by which the God of Israel revealed himself as the eternal self-existent one. "I am who I am." And when Jesus said "I am," the soldiers fell backward to the ground. The entire arresting force, hundreds of armed men coming to seize one unarmed rabbi, went down like cut wheat, knocked backward by nothing more than Jesus speaking the divine name. For a moment, the power and authority of the Son of God broke through the voluntary limitations he had accepted in his incarnation, demonstrating that he was not being arrested because he lacked power to resist, but because he was choosing to submit, not being captured because he was weak, but surrendering because it was his will. The soldiers recovered, got back to their feet, presumably shaken by what had just occurred, but pressed forward by duty or by the momentum of their mission. Jesus asked again, "Whom are you seeking?" They gave the same answer, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus responded with words that revealed his protective care even in the moment of his arrest. "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." He was negotiating terms of surrender, ensuring that his disciples would not be arrested with him, protecting them even as he gave himself up. John would later see in this exchange a fulfillment of Jesus' earlier prayer, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Even in arrest, even in betrayal, even in the beginning of his passion, Jesus was acting as the good shepherd who protects his sheep, ensuring that those given to him by the Father would not be seized by the enemy, guaranteeing their safety even at the cost of his own freedom. But not all the disciples understood what was happening or accepted Jesus' willing surrender. Peter, the same Peter who had just been sleeping while Jesus prayed, the one who had failed to watch for even 1 hour, suddenly erupted into action. He drew a sword. Apparently the disciples had at least 2 swords with them, though Jesus had told them earlier that night that 2 swords were enough, a statement that may have been ironic given that 2 swords were completely inadequate for actual military defense, and struck at one of the high priest's servants, cutting off his right ear. John, who knew the high priest's household, provides details the other Gospels omit. The servant's name was Malchus, and it was specifically his right ear that was severed. The injury was significant. In that culture, the right side carried symbolic importance, representing strength and honour. To lose the right ear was not just physical trauma, but social humiliation, a mark of shame that would follow Malchus for life. Peter's blow was aimed to kill. A sword stroke at the head rarely aims for ears but for the skull, and it was only Malchus's reflexive dodge, or Peter's poor aim, that resulted in an ear being severed rather than a fatal head wound. Peter's action, however well-intentioned, represented everything Jesus had been teaching against. Violence would not advance the kingdom. Swords would not establish God's rule. Physical force would not accomplish spiritual purposes. Peter wanted to fight, wanted to defend his Lord, wanted to do something rather than stand passively by while Jesus was arrested. But his action was not faith, but faithlessness, not courage, but failure to understand, not loyalty, but refusal to accept that Jesus' arrest was part of the plan rather than a disaster to be prevented. Jesus rebuked him sharply, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." The principle was both practical and prophetic. Those who live by violence tend to die by violence. Those who rely on swords rather than on God will discover that swords cut both ways. But Jesus added a crucial clarification that revealed the true reason he did not resist arrest. "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" 12 legions. A Roman legion numbered about 6,000 soldiers, so 12 legions would be 72,000 angels. An angelic army of overwhelming force, more than sufficient to annihilate not just this arresting party, but the entire Roman garrison in Judea, perhaps the whole Roman Empire if necessary. Jesus was not being arrested because he lacked power to resist. He was not submitting because he had no alternatives. He could call for supernatural deliverance, could summon forces that would make this armed mob seem like children with sticks, could unleash power that would vindicate him instantly and dramatically, but he would not. Because how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? The arrest was not plan B, not what happened because plan A failed, not a tragedy to be averted if possible. This was the plan predicted in Scripture, determined before the foundation of the world, necessary for the accomplishment of redemption. Resist arrest and the Scriptures remain unfulfilled. Call for angels and the prophecies prove false. Escape now, and humanity remains enslaved to sin and death forever. And then Jesus spoke to Peter with words that tied this moment back to the hours of prayer just completed, that connected the cup he had wrestled with in prayer to the cup he was now accepting in arrest. "Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" The cup. The same cup he had prayed about, the same cup he had asked might pass from him, the same cup he had finally accepted with the words, "Not my will, but yours be done." That cup was now being pressed to his lips, not literally but figuratively, in the form of arrest that would lead to trial, that would lead to crucifixion, that would lead to the drinking of divine wrath in the place of sinners. The cup could not be drunk if he called for angelic rescue. The cup required arrest, required trial, required execution. What Jesus had accepted in prayer he now embraced in action. What he had chosen in Gethsemane he now lived out in the arrest. The struggle was over, the decision was made, the cup would be drunk. But before the soldiers led him away, Jesus performed one final act of mercy toward his enemies. Luke records that he touched Malchus's ear and healed him. In the moment of his arrest, while surrounded by armed men who had come to seize him, while being betrayed by one disciple and defended violently by another, Jesus performed a miracle of healing for someone who was participating in his arrest. He restored what Peter's sword had severed, healed the injury his own follower had caused, demonstrated grace to an enemy in the very moment when that enemy was acting with hostility. The healing was the last miracle of Jesus' public ministry recorded in the Gospels, the final demonstration of his power and compassion before the hours of apparent powerlessness began, the ultimate expression of love toward those who hated him. Malchus went home that night with both ears intact. bearing in his body evidence of Jesus' mercy, carrying physical proof that the man being arrested was not the dangerous criminal the authorities claimed, but someone whose power extended to healing, even in the moment of his greatest vulnerability. Jesus then turned to the crowd, the soldiers, the temple police, the religious officials who had orchestrated this nighttime arrest, and addressed them with words that revealed both the cowardice of their timing and the theological significance of the moment. "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures might be fulfilled." The accusation was pointed. Jesus had been publicly accessible throughout his ministry, had taught openly in the temple courts earlier that very week, had made no attempt to hide or evade the authorities. If they truly believed he was a dangerous criminal worthy of armed arrest, they could have seized him any time during daylight in a public place. But they came at night, in a garden away from the crowds, with overwhelming force designed to intimidate and prevent resistance. They came like cowards, like thieves, like those who knew that what they were doing could not bear the light of day or the scrutiny of the people who had heard Jesus teach. Yet even as Jesus called out their cowardice, he acknowledged the deeper reality. But this is your hour, and the power of darkness. There was a sense in which this moment belonged to them, this hour was theirs, this temporary victory was being permitted. Not because they had genuine power over him. He had just demonstrated by laying them flat on the ground that he possessed power they could not match. But because the Father had determined that for this hour the forces of evil would appear to triumph, that darkness would seem to overcome light, that the power of Satan working through human evil would accomplish what it had sought from the beginning, the death of the Son of God. Yet what they meant for evil, God meant for good. What they intended as defeat, God planned as victory. What they saw as darkness's triumph, God knew as darkness's doom. They thought they were ending a troublesome ministry. God was accomplishing eternal redemption. They imagined they were eliminating a threat. God was crushing the serpent's head. They believed they were killing a man. God was offering his son as a sacrifice for sin. This was their hour, but only because God had given it to them. Only because the script required this scene. Only because redemption's drama demanded this dark moment before resurrection's dawn. The soldiers moved forward and arrested Jesus, binding his hands with ropes or chains. The one who had just healed with a touch now stood with hands bound. The one who could call 12 legions of angels submitted to being tied like a common criminal. The one who had knocked an entire armed detachment to the ground with 2 words allowed himself to be restrained by men whose power over him was only what he permitted them to have. He was, as Isaiah had prophesied, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, opening not his mouth in protest or self-defense, submitting because submission was required, accepting bonds because the cup demanded it, allowing arrest because the cross waited and the world's salvation hung in the balance. The moment had come. The betrayal was complete. The arrest was accomplished. The surrender that began in prayer now manifested in chains. The cup accepted in the garden would now be drunk on the cross. Jesus stood bound among his enemies, betrayed by one disciple, defended foolishly by another, about to be abandoned by all, facing alone what he had chosen to face because no one else could face it for him, enduring what he did not have to endure because humanity's only hope required it. The torches began to move, leading their prisoner away from the garden toward the trials that awaited, toward the mockery and beatings, toward the crown of thorns and the purple robe, toward Pilate and the crowd and the choice between Jesus and Barabbas, toward the cross that stood waiting on Golgotha for the one who had already chosen it hours earlier beneath the olive trees, in prayer, in blood sweat, in the words that sealed both his fate and the world's hope. "Not my will, but yours be done." As the soldiers began leading Jesus away, bound and under guard, something happened that Jesus had predicted just hours earlier, but that the disciples had vehemently denied would ever occur. They fled, all of them. Every single one of the 11 remaining disciples the men who had left everything to follow Jesus, who had witnessed his miracles, who had declared their loyalty even unto death, who had promised they would never abandon him. They scattered into the night like frightened animals, leaving their master alone in the hands of his enemies. The prophecy Jesus had quoted at supper was fulfilled with devastating precision. "I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." The words came from Zechariah, spoken centuries before about a shepherd whom God would strike, whose flock would subsequently scatter. Jesus had applied these words to himself and to his disciples, predicting that when he was struck, they would all fall away. Peter had objected most strenuously, insisting that even if everyone else abandoned Jesus, he never would. The others had echoed Peter's protest, all declaring their readiness to die with Jesus rather than desert him. But courage declared in a well-lit upper room over dinner proved insufficient in a dark garden facing armed soldiers. Loyalty promised, while reclining at table evaporated when arrest became real and danger immediate. Commitment sworn in the abstract collapsed when tested in the concrete. The disciples had meant their promises, their intentions had been sincere. But as Jesus had warned them just hours earlier, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And now, with their teacher arrested and their own lives potentially threatened, flesh overwhelmed spirit, fear conquered loyalty, and self-preservation triumphed over sworn allegiance. The flight was not dignified or orderly. This was not a tactical retreat or strategic withdrawal. This was panic, pure and simple, men running for their lives, disappearing into the darkness of the Mount of Olives, seeking whatever cover the night and the terrain could provide, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the soldiers who had just arrested their master. They did not stay to see where Jesus was taken. They did not follow at a distance to monitor his fate. They did not gather to discuss what to do next. They simply ran, each man for himself, the community that had been forged over 3 years of shared ministry disintegrating in moments under the pressure of fear. Mark's Gospel includes a peculiar detail found nowhere else. A young man who was following Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, who was seized by the soldiers but escaped, leaving the cloth behind and fleeing naked. Many scholars believe this young man was Mark himself, that he included this embarrassing detail as a kind of signature, a way of saying, "I was there, and I ran too." If so, the detail adds poignant testimony to the universal nature of the disciples' failure. Even those who came to watch, who were not part of the inner circle, who had no official standing as disciples, even they fled when danger threatened. The young man ran so desperately that he left his clothing in the soldiers' hands rather than be captured, choosing the shame of nakedness over the terror of arrest. The flight fulfilled prophecy, but that did not make it less tragic or less painful. Jesus had known it would happen, had warned them explicitly, had even prayed for them in his high priestly prayer earlier that evening, asking the Father to protect them and keep them in his name. Yet knowing it would happen did not prevent the abandonment from being abandonment, did not make the loneliness less acute, did not reduce the pain of seeing those he loved prove unable or unwilling to stand with him in his hour of greatest need. The contrast between Jesus' behaviour and the disciples' behaviour could not be more stark. When the armed crowd came for Jesus, he stepped forward, identified himself, negotiated for his disciples' release, and accepted arrest calmly, despite having power to resist. When danger threatened the disciples, they scattered in panic, thought only of self-preservation, abandoned the one they had promised to defend. Jesus faced his fear and embraced suffering. They fled from fear and sought safety. Jesus drank the cup. They spilled it and ran. Peter, however, did not run far. After the initial panic, after whatever distance his fear initially drove him to put between himself and the arresting party, something drew him back. Perhaps shame at his cowardice, perhaps genuine concern for Jesus, perhaps inability to simply abandon his master completely despite his terror. Whatever the motivation, Peter began following the procession from a distance, staying far enough back to avoid being identified as a disciple, but close enough to see where they were taking Jesus. The phrase "following at a distance" captures the essence of Peter's failure. He was following, He had not completely abandoned Jesus, had not fled beyond recall like some of the others apparently did. But he was following at a distance, far enough back that his association with Jesus was not evident, maintaining enough separation that he could plausibly deny any connection, keeping just close enough to observe but not close enough to actually share in what Jesus was experiencing. It was discipleship with a safety margin, loyalty with an escape route, courage with cowardice mixed in equal measure. John also followed, and John's connections to the high priest's household, how he acquired them the Gospels never explain, allowed him to gain entrance to the courtyard where Jesus was being held. Peter followed as far as the gate but was initially denied entry until John, already inside, spoke to the servant girl who kept the door and got Peter admitted. So Peter found himself in the courtyard of the high priest residence, surrounded by servants and guards, warming himself at their fire, while inside the house Jesus was being subjected to an illegal nighttime trial before a hastily assembled council. The trials that Jesus faced, first before Annas, then before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, later before Pilate, then before Herod, then before Pilate again, were a mockery of justice, proceedings designed not to determine guilt or innocence but to provide legal cover for a decision already made. The religious authorities had decided weeks earlier that Jesus must die. The only question was how to accomplish it legally, or at least with enough legal appearance to satisfy Roman oversight and avoid provoking the crowds who had welcomed Jesus triumphantly into Jerusalem just days before. But Peter's focus was not on the trials inside. His attention was on his own survival, on maintaining the pretense that he was merely an observer, with no stake in what happened to the prisoner being interrogated within. And as he sat by the fire, trying to look like he belonged there, trying to appear to be just another servant or guard curious about the night's events, he was recognized. 3 times by 3 different people, Peter was identified as having been with Jesus. And 3 times, exactly as Jesus had predicted, Peter denied it. The first challenge came from the servant girl who had let him into the courtyard. Looking at him in the firelight, she said, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." The identification was not accusatory, not threatening, simply observational. But Peter felt the danger immediately. If he admitted association with Jesus, he might be arrested too, might face the same fate his master was facing. So he denied it, claiming not to understand what she was talking about, insisting he did not know the man. He moved away from the fire, trying to escape notice, but another servant saw him and made the same identification, telling the bystanders, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again Peter denied it, this time with an oath, swearing that he did not know Jesus. The oath added weight to the denial, invoked a divine witness to what he was claiming, made the lie more emphatic and more damning. Then, after a little while, several bystanders approached Peter and declared with certainty, "Surely you are one of them, for your accent gives you away." Peter's Galilean dialect marked him as coming from the same region as Jesus, made his denial less plausible, identified him as likely to be connected to the prisoner regardless of his protestations. And Peter, now desperate, began to invoke curses on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." The progression of Peter's denials reveals the accelerating moral collapse that occurs once the first compromise is made. The first denial was relatively mild, claiming not to understand what the girl meant. The second added an oath. The third escalated to cursing and swearing, Peter calling down divine judgment on himself if he was lying, using the strongest possible language to convince his questioners that he truly had no connection to Jesus. With each denial, Peter sank deeper into betrayal, used stronger language to distance himself from his master, became more emphatic in rejecting any association with the one he had promised just hours earlier never to abandon. And then, immediately after the third denial, while the words were still on Peter's lips, a rooster crowed. The sound cut through the night air, an ordinary sound signalling the approach of dawn, the kind of sound that normally would be barely noticed. But to Peter in that moment, the rooster's crow was like a sword thrust into his heart, because he remembered. Jesus had predicted this, not just that Peter would deny him, but specifically that he would do so 3 times before the rooster crowed. What had seemed impossible at dinner what Peter had vehemently insisted would never happen, what he had been absolutely certain his loyalty would prevent, it had all come to pass exactly as Jesus said it would. Luke adds a detail that makes the moment even more devastating. At that moment, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Jesus, in the midst of his own ordeal, in the middle of his illegal trial, at a moment when he had every reason to be focused entirely on his own suffering, he saw Peter. Perhaps he was being moved from one part of the house to another. Perhaps a window or doorway provided line of sight to the courtyard. However it happened, Jesus and Peter made eye contact, and in that look Peter saw everything. Knowledge of what Peter had just done, confirmation that Jesus had predicted it accurately, disappointment at Peter's failure, yet also something else. Something that looked like compassion, like understanding, like the gaze of someone who had warned this would happen, and yet still loved the one who had fulfilled the warning. Peter went out and wept bitterly. Not mere tears of frustration or sadness, but bitter weeping, the kind of crying that comes from the depths of the soul when someone realizes they have become exactly what they swore they would never be, when the gap between their own self-image and reality becomes too wide to bridge, when shame and grief combine to produce anguish beyond words. Peter had failed completely, had denied Jesus repeatedly, had used the strongest possible language to distance himself from the one he loved, had proven that for all his bold promises and confident declarations, he was exactly what Jesus had said, willing in spirit, but weak in flesh. The other disciples scattered in the darkness did not even have Peter's proximity to witness what they had abandoned Jesus to face. They had fled into the night and remained hidden, whether from shame or fear or confusion. The community that had travelled together, eaten together, ministered together, learned together, it was shattered, dispersed, broken by the events of this night. The 12 were now the 11, Judas having already departed to his own destruction, and the 11 were nowhere to be found when their master needed them most. The tragedy of the disciples' failure was not that they were uniquely weak or unusually cowardly. The tragedy was that they were human, that they faced testing beyond their capacity, that their faith, however genuine, was not yet mature enough to withstand the pressure of this crisis. They would all, in time, become faithful witnesses, would suffer for the gospel, would give their lives for the one they denied or abandoned this night. Peter would eventually be crucified for his faith, would request to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. But all of that lay in the future, on the other side of resurrection and Pentecost, after the Spirit came and transformed them from frightened men into bold apostles. For now they were simply failures. They had promised much and delivered nothing. They had sworn loyalty and demonstrated cowardice. They had declared themselves ready to die with Jesus and instead fled at the first sign of danger. And Jesus faced alone what he had always known he would have to face alone, carried a burden no human could share, drank a cup no disciple could help him drink. The loneliness of Christ in his passion is perhaps its most poignant element. He was surrounded by enemies, mocked by those who should have recognized him, condemned by the religious leaders who claimed to serve the God he revealed, executed by the political authorities who claimed to dispense justice. But he was also abandoned by his friends, denied by his closest follower, deserted by those who had promised never to leave him. The crowds that had shouted Hosanna on Palm Sunday would shout, "Crucify him" on Good Friday. The disciples who had promised to die with him would run away before he was even sentenced. The people he came to save would demand his death. The mission he came to accomplish would require him to be utterly alone, forsaken by humans, and, for a terrible moment on the cross, even experiencing separation from the Father. But the disciples' failure, while real and tragic, was not final. Jesus had prayed for them, had interceded for them, had asked the Father to protect them and keep them. He had told Peter specifically, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." The failure was predicted, but so was the restoration. The denial would be real, but so would the return. The scattering would be devastating, but the regathering would come. For now, though, in the dark hours after midnight, as Jesus was shuttled from trial to trial, from Annas to Caiaphas to Pilate and beyond, he was alone. The disciples were scattered. Peter was weeping. John was somewhere in the shadows, the only one who would eventually make his way to the cross. The others were hiding, consumed by shame or fear or disbelief at how quickly everything had fallen apart. The shepherd had been struck. The sheep had scattered. The prophecy was fulfilled. The loneliness was complete. And the one who had wrestled in Gethsemane with the cup of God's wrath now faced the full weight of human sin and divine judgment, without human support, without earthly comfort, without anyone standing beside him as he marched toward the cross that he had chosen in the garden, that he had accepted in prayer, that he would bear alone because only he could bear it, because the salvation of the world required it, because he had looked into the cup and said, "Not my will, but yours," and meant it even unto death, even death on a cross, even the death that would appear to be defeat but would prove to be victory, even the darkness that would seem final but would give way 3 days later to light that would never end. The story of Gethsemane ends with Jesus bound and led away, with disciples scattered into the night, with betrayal accomplished and arrest completed. But the significance of what happened in that garden extends far beyond that Thursday night 2,000 years ago. Gethsemane was not merely the prologue to Calvary, but the place where the cross was truly chosen, where the battle for human salvation was fought and won not with nails and spear, but with prayer and surrender, where the fate of humanity was decided not by what soldiers did to Jesus on Friday morning, but by what Jesus chose on Thursday night. The traditional Christian narrative often treats Gethsemane as a way station on the road to the cross, an episode of psychological preparation before the real work of redemption accomplished on Calvary. But deeper reflection reveals that Gethsemane was itself the decisive moment, the hinge on which everything else turned, the place where victory was secured even before the battle appeared to begin. What happened on the cross was the execution of a plan finalized in the garden. What was accomplished through crucifixion flowed from the choice made in prayer. The cross displayed publicly what Gethsemane determined privately. Golgotha was theatre. Gethsemane was the real arena. This understanding transforms how we read the gospel accounts of Jesus' passion. The agony in the garden was not weakness but strength, not hesitation but the most profound courage, not doubt but the deliberate embrace of certainty's costliest demands. When Jesus fell on his face and prayed for the cup to pass, he was not showing that he was less than divine, but proving he was fully human. When he sweat blood under the weight of what he faced, he was not demonstrating inadequacy, but revealing the genuine horror of what bearing human sin and divine wrath would entail. When he rose from prayer and accepted arrest, he had already won the victory that Calvary would make visible to the watching world. The connection between Gethsemane and Eden runs throughout Christian theological reflection, and for good reason. These two gardens frame the story of human redemption, bookending the long narrative of fall and restoration with scenes that mirror and reverse each other. In Eden, the first Adam faced testing in a garden of beauty and abundance, where every need was met and fellowship with God was unbroken. The test was simple. Would he trust God's word and obey God's command, or would he doubt divine goodness and seek autonomy through disobedience? The first Adam chose self over God, doubt over trust, autonomy over obedience. And through that choice, sin entered the world, death spread to all humanity, and creation itself fell under the curse of human rebellion. In Gethsemane, the second Adam faced his testing in a garden of crushing and anguish, where agony was overwhelming and the cup offered contained not fruit, but wrath. The test was equally clear. Would he obey the Father's will even unto death, or would he choose escape over mission, self-preservation over sacrifice, his own comfort over humanity's salvation? The second Adam chose God over self, trust over doubt, obedience over autonomy. And through that choice, redemption was secured, death was defeated, and the curse was reversed. Where the first Adam brought death, the second Adam brought life. Where the first chose comfort and received condemnation, the second chose suffering and accomplished salvation. Where the first disobedience in a garden brought catastrophe, the second's obedience in a garden brought hope. The Apostle Paul would articulate this theology explicitly. For as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. The one man's disobedience was Adam's in Eden. The one man's obedience was Christ's, not primarily on the cross, where he passively suffered what was done to him, but in Gethsemane, where he actively chose what would happen to him, where he wrestled with alternatives and embraced the path of suffering, where he aligned his human will with the divine purpose and said the words that sealed both his fate and the world's redemption. Not my will, but yours be done. This obedience was learned through suffering, as the book of Hebrews explains. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Not learned in the sense of discovering something previously unknown, but learned experientially, existentially, in the embodied way that transforms intellectual knowledge into lived reality. Jesus had always been obedient in his divine nature. In Gethsemane, he learned what obedience costs in human nature, experienced what it means to choose the Father's will when every human instinct screams for relief, discovered in his own flesh what submission requires when submission leads through the valley of the shadow of death. The cup that Jesus accepted in Gethsemane, that symbol of divine wrath, that container of judgment against sin, that terrible mixture of humanity's guilt and God's righteous fury, underwent a transformation through his willingness to drink it. What was offered as a cup of wrath, he accepted and transformed into a cup of salvation. What contained judgment, he drank down and converted into mercy. What threatened destruction, he consumed and turned into deliverance. The cup did not change its contents. The wrath was real, the judgment deserved, the suffering genuine. But by drinking it voluntarily, by taking it upon himself substitutionally, by bearing the punishment meant for others, Jesus transformed what the cup accomplished. Those for whom he drank it would never have to taste it. The wrath that fell on him would never fall on them. The judgment he bore satisfied divine justice, so that mercy could flow freely to all who would believe. This is why Paul could later write about the Lord's Supper. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. The cup that Jesus drank in spiritual reality in Gethsemane and on Calvary becomes the cup that believers drink sacramentally in remembrance and proclamation. But the contents are reversed. What Jesus drank was wrath and judgment. What believers drink is grace and salvation. What crushed him liberates us. What killed him gives us life. The cup of sorrow became the cup of celebration. The cup of death became the cup of eternal life. The cup that Jesus prayed might pass from him becomes the cup that we are invited to receive from him. Gethsemane also reveals something profound about the nature of prayer itself. Jesus modelled for all believers what honest prayer looks like, bringing genuine desires to God, expressing authentic feelings, asking for what seems best to human wisdom, while maintaining ultimate submission to divine will. The prayer, "Not my will but yours," has become the template for Christian prayer. The words that should frame every petition, the attitude that should undergird every request. We are invited to be honest with God about what we want, to express our preferences freely, to ask for what we think is best. But we are also called to hold those preferences with open hands, to trust that God's wisdom exceeds our own, to submit our desires to his purposes, to choose obedience over comfort when the two conflict. This is not passive resignation or fatalistic acceptance of whatever happens. It is active trust, deliberate surrender, the choice to believe that God's will is better than our preferences even when we cannot see how that could possibly be true. Jesus in Gethsemane demonstrated this perfectly. He genuinely did not want to drink the cup. His human nature recoiled from it with intensity that produced blood sweat. His desire for the cup to pass was authentic, arising from real human aversion to suffering. Yet he subordinated that genuine desire to the Father's will, trusted that divine purposes were worth human suffering, chose obedience despite the cost. Every believer faces Gethsemane moments, times when what God calls us to do conflicts with what we naturally desire, when obedience requires sacrifice, when following Christ means embracing suffering we would rather avoid. It might be forgiving someone who wounded us deeply. It might be remaining in a difficult situation rather than escaping to something easier. It might be giving sacrificially when we would rather keep what we have. It might be speaking truth when silence would be safer. It might be loving enemies when we would rather hate them. In all these moments and countless others, the prayer of Gethsemane becomes our prayer. Not my will, but yours. The disciples' failure in Gethsemane also teaches crucial lessons. Their sleeping while Jesus prayed, their fleeing when he was arrested, Peter's denying when questioned. All of this demonstrates the gap between good intentions and actual faithfulness, between what we promise and what we deliver, between the resolve we feel and the courage we demonstrate. The disciples were not insincere when they declared their loyalty. Peter genuinely meant it when he swore he would die rather than deny Jesus, but meaning it was not enough. Sincerity could not bridge the gap between human weakness and divine strength, between what they wanted to be and what they were capable of being in their own power. Yet Jesus had prayed for them. Before Gethsemane, in his high priestly prayer, he had interceded for them, asking the Father to protect them, to keep them in his name, to guard them from the evil one. And that prayer was effective. Yes, they failed. Yes, they fled. Yes, Peter denied. But they were not destroyed by their failure. They were not abandoned because of their cowardice. The prayer Jesus prayed protected them through their worst moments, preserved them despite their weakness, ensured that failure would not be final. Peter would be restored. The disciples would be regathered. The scattered sheep would become bold apostles. The men who fled in fear would eventually face martyrdom with courage, not because they became intrinsically stronger, but because what they could not do in their own power, grace enabled them to do through the Spirit. This offers hope to every believer who has failed, who has made promises they could not keep, who has discovered the gap between intention and action, between what they want to be and what they are. The disciples' story demonstrates that failure is not final, that weakness does not disqualify, that Jesus continues to work with and through people who have proven themselves unreliable. The same grace that restored Peter after his denial, that regathered the disciples after their flight, that transformed cowards into martyrs and failures into faithful witnesses, that grace remains available to all who fall and rise again, who fail and repent, who discover their own inadequacy and cast themselves on divine sufficiency. The legacy of Gethsemane extends through 20 centuries of Christian experience. Countless believers have drawn strength from knowing that Jesus faced his darkest hour with prayer, that he chose obedience despite overwhelming anguish, that he embraced the Father's will even when his human nature recoiled from it. Martyrs facing execution have taken comfort in Gethsemane's example. Missionaries confronting hardship have found courage in Jesus' determination. Ordinary believers struggling through suffering have discovered that the one who sweat blood in prayer understands their pain, that the one who fell on his face in agony can sympathize with their weakness, that the one who wrestled with the cup knows intimately what it costs to choose God's will over personal comfort. The writer of Hebrews captured this truth beautifully. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who, in every respect, has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. The sympathy is not abstract or theoretical. Jesus can sympathize because he experienced it, because he knows from the inside what it feels like to face overwhelming temptation, to struggle with suffering, to wrestle with obedience when obedience requires everything. Gethsemane proves his sympathy is genuine, that his understanding of human struggle is not distant observation, but intimate participation, that when believers cry out in their own dark nights of the soul, they pray to one who has been there, who knows what it feels like, who can genuinely say, I understand, because he does. But Gethsemane is more than example or encouragement. It is the place where Jesus did what we cannot do, where he bore what we cannot bear, where he chose what we would never choose, where he accomplished what makes our own struggles meaningful rather than futile. We are not called to drink the cup of God's wrath. Jesus drank that for us. We are not required to bear the world's sin. Jesus bore it in our place. We are not commanded to suffer separation from God. Jesus experienced that, so we never have to. What Gethsemane reveals is not just that Jesus faced hardship like we do, but that he faced hardship unlike anything we will ever encounter, bearing burdens we will never carry because he carried them for us. The garden where Jesus prayed still exists. Pilgrims visit it, tourists photograph it. The ancient olive trees continue to stand as silent witnesses to what happened there. But the significance of Gethsemane transcends geography. Every place of prayer can become Gethsemane. Every moment of surrender can echo that night. Every choice to embrace God's will, despite personal cost, participates in what Jesus pioneered in the garden. The physical location matters to history, but the spiritual reality matters to every believer who faces the choice between comfort and obedience, between self and God, between escape and mission. The story ends where it began, with a choice. Jesus chose the cross before the nails touched his flesh, accepted the cup before it was pressed to his lips on Calvary, embraced suffering before the soldiers arrested him. Gethsemane was where that choice was made, where the battle was fought, where victory was won. What followed was execution of a plan already determined, completion of a mission already accepted, fulfillment of a choice already embraced. And because Jesus said, "Not my will but yours," in Gethsemane, because he chose obedience over escape, because he accepted the cup rather than calling for 12 legions of angels, because he was bound when he could have remained free, because he endured the cross when he could have avoided it. Because of all of this, humanity has hope. The cup of wrath was drunk. The price was paid. The sacrifice was offered. The obedience was rendered. The sin was borne. The judgment was satisfied. And 3 days after Gethsemane led to Golgotha, the tomb was empty. Death was defeated. And the one who had chosen suffering emerged victorious, bearing in his body the marks of the cup he had drunk, but shining with the glory of the life he had won. Gethsemane's legacy is this, that true strength is found not in escape but in surrender, that victory comes through submission rather than resistance, that the path to glory runs through the valley of suffering, that saying yes to God's will matters more than any human preference or desire. The cross Jesus carried began in a garden. The salvation he accomplished was secured in prayer. The cup he drank was accepted beneath olive trees. And every believer who follows him walks the same path, not to accomplish what he accomplished, for that work is finished, but to embrace the same spirit of surrender, to pray the same prayer of submission, to choose obedience over comfort, to say with Jesus and because of Jesus and through the power Jesus provides, "Not my will, but yours be done." The garden waits still, not for another sacrifice, but for disciples who will learn from the first one, not for another cup to be drunk, but for believers who will trust the one who drank it, not for another battle to be fought, but for followers who will live in the victory already won. Gethsemane stands as eternal testimony that God's purposes prevail, that obedience matters more than ease, that surrender is the path to triumph, and that the cup of sorrow Jesus drank there became the cup of salvation the world has been invited to receive from his hand. Not a cup of wrath, but of grace, not of judgment, but of mercy, not of death, but of life eternal, offered freely to all who believe in the one who chose the cross in a garden before ever arriving at Golgotha, who accepted suffering in prayer before experiencing it in execution, who won the victory in the watches of the night that would be revealed in the light of resurrection morning,